Do you have any regrets about your decision to actually become Secretary of Defense?
I would tell you that if you're enjoying life and it's shortly after an election and the phone rings, don't answer the phone, obviously.
What do you think are the most important national security issues?
In terms of urgency, it would be North Korea. In terms of power, it would be Russia. And in terms of political will, it would be China.
Have you ever thought of running for office, maybe President of the United States yourself?
You're a very bad man.
Would you fix your tie, please?
Well, people wouldn't recognize me if my tie was fixed, but okay. Just leave it this way. All right. I don't consider myself a journalist, and nobody else would consider myself a journalist. I began to take on the life of being an interviewer, even though I have a day job running a private equity firm. How do you define leadership? What is it that makes somebody tick?
Mad Dog plays no games, right?
Most of the people that I've interviewed in this series are people I've known quite some time. In the case of Jim Mattis, I had never met the man before. Because of his nickname, Mad Dog, I thought, uh-oh, I better be careful when I shake his hand. He might be, growling or mad at me or something like that. But actually, it was the opposite. I recognized quickly that he has a certain reserve and a certain manner that would make a person want to follow him as a leader in the military. And also, I suspect that had he never gone into the military, had he been in business or in politics, he would have been successful there as well. Although I only spent this 1 hour with him in interview, I really think that he's a person who has great potential to, again, be a leader in our country. And I don't think we've heard the last of Jim Mattis.
You are minding your own business after having spent 40 plus years in the Marines. Mm-hmm. You're out in your native state, Washington, and you get a call from Vice President-elect Pence to come and meet Donald Trump, who you had never met before. What did you think that meeting was about, and do you have any regrets about going to the meeting or your decision to actually become Secretary of Defense?
I don't live a life with regrets. I would tell you that if you're enjoying life and it's shortly after an election and the phone rings, don't answer the phone, obviously. But on a more serious note, I was brought up by the greatest generation, and I was brought up to believe that government service is an honor, it's a privilege, but it's a duty. And whether the President of the United States asks you and they're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter. As long as you're prepared to do it, as long as you know you can do it, then the response is affirmative.
Okay, so you took the job, but you resigned after a few years over the policy disagreement. Any regrets about having resigned?
Well, as you'll all understand, ladies and gentlemen, these are the finest young patriots in our country signing that blank check payable to all of us with their lives. The men and women of our military, and I loved being back around. It's probably the best job I could have imagined, and I only miss being around those people. There just comes a time, I don't live a life of regrets. There comes a time and you know what you've got to do.
So you don't ever look back?
No, I look forward.
I'm
like Dallas.
See, okay. I wish I could do that. I always look back at the deals I should have done. I missed. I wish I had that same ability. But okay, so you disagreed with President Trump on Syria. And let me ask you, I realize you've been very, very careful about not criticizing President Trump at all since you've left in any public forum. So I'm not probably going to persuade you to do so here, not that you want to do so. But the reason that you want to be not commenting on your service as Secretary of Defense or saying anything negative about President Trump is what? Is it because you're a former cabinet officer, former military person, or just generally think it's not a good policy to do that?
I resigned over a policy disagreement. You're right. I put that disagreement in a page-and-a-half letter. The letter's been released. That's all the more I need to say about it. The French call it a devoir de reserve, a duty of reserve, a duty of quiet. You don't need to have a former Secretary of Defense talking about the current policies in a way that's injurious to the country. And I would point out that Secretary Ash Carter, my predecessor under the Obama administration, said the same thing when he would respond to a congressional question that he considered political, even while he was there. So it's not unique to me, is my point. It's not some protective effort around President Trump.
So you feel, let's say years down the road, you might feel better about commenting
It's a
on
good
this.
question, David, but like most of us in this room, I'm from the West as well. And there's something we call you ride for the brand. And I can always come out and say on this policy or this strategy, here's where I come down. That's not meant as a personal or political attack. And I don't feel that I need to be silent about those things after that president leaves office. But while the president's there, the last thing we want to do is to have the former Secretary of Defense coming out saying, I disagree with a certain policy. Guess what? The president is still the commander-in-chief as elected by the American people, and the troops have to obey him. The last thing you want to do is have the troops saying, well, the former Secretary of Defense doesn't agree with that policy. That's why I don't talk about it while they're in office.
So does President Trump call you for advice anymore, or not so much?
No, the phone hasn't rang on that one.
Okay, all right. Now, you have recently come out with a book, Call Sign Chaos, with Bing West, and it's a terrific book. I highly recommend it. So explain what Call Sign Chaos means for those who haven't read the book. What does chaos mean there?
So I was a colonel out in the Mojave Desert, and I had an operations officer from Brooklyn with a rather droll sense of humor. And one day I was done with another one of my brilliant ideas, talking to my operations officer of this regiment of about 7,000 sailors and Marines out in the Mojave Desert. And as I was walking out, I saw on his whiteboard, chaos written. I said, what's that about? And he said, oh, don't worry about that. You don't need to know about that. And so, oh, yes, I do. So I used some of my powers of persuasion. I waterboarded him. And I found out my irreverent subordinates had decided that my call sign should be chaos. Colonel has another outstanding suggestion. It was rather tongue-in-cheek.
Okay.
They didn't see the brilliance of all my ideas that I identified. So I adopted that as my call sign, and anytime you hear about this mad dog thing, my troops all laughed at it, knowing my call sign was chaos. That was never my favorite nickname that the press assigned me on a slow news day.
Well, let's talk about that. In this book,
No, I'd rather not, actually.
you actually never use the expression mad dog. You never describe how you got that. You obviously don't like it. So, I would think being mad dog shows you're tough and so forth. Why don't you like that and you don't ever use that name? Is that right?
Well, first, the Marines teach you to be tough in other ways than self-aggrandizing stuff like that. But I think, too, one thing I've had to do, and you'll all understand this, is sign a lot of next to kin letters. And the last thing they need is to think there's someone with some, self-image of Mad Dog up there with their son's lives basically in his hands. So I shy away from those words very much.
You have signed more than 800 of those letters?
I have.
So that must be the most difficult thing to do, is to write to next of kin that their son or daughter has been killed.
It's difficult for me. It's nowhere near what the families go through.
So you have been very involved in meeting with Gold Star families since you've retired, and that must be a very emotional experience to do that.
I think it's necessary that we pay our respects and we never forget the sacrifices of those families. When you think this great big experiment that we have that you and I call America, it's going to need to be defended, and we're going to continue to need this sort of commitment, this devotion to our country.
Your first time in real combat is when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. When you got into Kuwait relatively quickly, were you surprised at how, relatively speaking, it was easy to get there?
It was a lot of training and a lot of fire support, and it was. I'm very proud of that campaign, because it's the last time I brought everyone home alive.
So when you started your life, you started in the Northwest, Washington State, and you were a great athlete or a great student, or which would you say?
None of the above.
Neither. Okay, but
yeah.
you were a little bit wild, and you would do things that today I would think parents wouldn't let kids do. So when you were 13 years old, your parents would let you hitchhike around the West. Is that right?
Well, I maintained a degree of silence about some of my activities around my parents.
Okay.
But yeah, I did start hitchhiking. I think it was a more trusting nation in those days, and my parents were rather adventurous. They weren't irresponsible, and had they known some of this, they probably would have put the kibosh on it.
So how did you actually come to the Marines? Did you say, I'm going to be drafted, I'd rather be in the Marines than the Army? Or did you, like my father went in the Marines and he said, I like the uniform, it's a great uniform, I'm going to go into the Marines. What was it that appealed to you?
Well, one thing was I probably would have been drafted. It was during that era there, but it was almost, it was a little bit unexamined. It was more or less just assumed if you went in the military. A lot of the guys in my neighborhood, my older brother right then was in Vietnam as a Marine. It was just kind of a natural thing. It wasn't a very reflective or examined decision.
Okay, so you go into the Marines. Now, what was your first assignment after you left officer training?
It was the best assignment I had in the military. It was second lieutenant in the infantry. You have about 40 sailors and Marines, and there's nobody between you and your troops. You live right amongst them. You know them as well as you know your brothers. You can spot them 200 yards away by their walk. You know who they are. It's just a great tight-knit crew.
Okay, so your first time in real combat is when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and President Bush 41 decides that the United States is going to have a response.
Now, the 28 countries have no choice but to drive Saddam from Kuwait by force. We will not fail.
What was your involvement and what did you do in that war?
I commanded an infantry battalion. I was in the 1st Marine Division. And those of you who remember the war, you remember the big minefields and the trenches of oil and all that sort of stuff, barbed wire. And my battalion job was to open 2 of the routes through those for the Marines to follow.
And did you think at the time, there were predictions there would be tens of thousands of American troops killed. Did you, when you got into Kuwait relatively quickly, were you surprised at how, relatively speaking, it was easy to get there?
It was a lot of training and a lot of fire support, and it was. I'm very proud of that campaign because it's the last time I brought everyone home alive. So,
Okay.
Yeah, I was a little surprised.
So when now you're an officer, when an officer, you get special treatment when you're in that kind of combat. Do you sleep in the same places as the troops, or you get a better place to sleep, better food? How do you treat your troops?
In the infantry, you always eat last. You never live better than the troops. Matter of fact, even when I was a 2-star general, we established what's called the level of comfort for a 23,000-man division as whatever an infantry lance corporal, which is a very young troop, has. If he has nothing but a blanket to lay in, then nobody has anything but a blanket except the wounded and the sick, and those we do everything we can for. But everybody lives like a lance corporal.
So that food that you eat, MRE food, is that really any good or not so great when you're in combat?
Yeah, let's just say it's not quite as good as the meal we had today,
all right.
David is.
So eventually you get back into combat again because 9/11 occurs. So your next assignment is to go into Afghanistan and to try to capture, I assume, Osama bin Laden. Is that right, more or less?
Right.
So in the end, you go over there, you have all the troops, and why did you not capture Osama bin Laden?
I had an admiral who'd read a lot of history, and he said, no one's held Kabul in 500 years. They're going to fall back on Kandahar, their spiritual home, and dig in. Can you get the Marines from the Mediterranean Fleet and the Pacific Fleet together? This 3-star admiral asked me, I was a 1-star Marine, and move against Kandahar. I said, yeah, I can do that. And so we got the troops in, and then the intelligence agency said Osama bin Laden is in one of 2 valleys. They were very sure of this. They had him pinpointed. So I had a real quick computer study done, and I knew which mountains on the Pakistan border, if you put troops on them, could see each other and block the 2 valleys, and then I was going to move my troops up the 2 valleys. But I'd changed from Navy command and control to Army command and control, and I'd not spent the time getting to know my boss 900 miles away, and we missed the opportunity, and the person who made the mistake was me. I just assumed because we were there to go after this guy that everybody was attuned to the intel You shouldn't make assumptions like that when an organization is shifting and adapting.
They told you to pull back, in fact.
Well, they didn't tell me to go. We didn't pull back,
okay.
but we didn't go in.
Okay, so ultimately you leave Afghanistan and you come back to the United States again.
Right,
But then you are asked to go into another war in Iraq.
right.
So you get in there, and then ultimately the fights between the Sunnis and the Shiites turned out to be much more than anybody anticipated. As you look back on the political problems that arose in Iraq subsequent to Saddam Hussein having been captured, what do you think was the mistake that was made, or what could have been done better in hindsight?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting to get the question and look back in hindsight, but let me tell you what it looked like in foresight. We're in basically the summer, very hot summer of 2000, what would it be, 3, and Iraq has fallen. And at one of my briefs one day, a young officer who was briefing said, by the way, the enemy is picking this up, that somehow we're going to disband the Iraqi army. We were just bringing the Iraqis back into their barracks. We were starting to pay them. We were trying to talk with them that we're not here to occupy or humiliate you. You work for a jerk. He's gone. You're going to be the new Iraqi army. And I dismissed it as idle gossip and just said, forget that. Let's get on with the brief. Next day I walk in and everybody's quiet in this great big cavernous palace we'd taken over. And the lieutenant down there has a piece of paper for me in 3 sentences. It said, the Iraqi army is hereby disbanded. First lieutenant, fresh out of his undergraduate days, said, General, we just started an insurgency. That's what it looked like in foresight. Didn't take hindsight to see the problem.
But ultimately, when the insurgency occurred, you were trying to, at one point, capture Fallujah, among other things, but you found there just wasn't enough political support to go and do the tough things that you thought the military needed to do. Is that right?
Well, we had a troop cap put on us, so we didn't have enough troops. For example, I was responsible for an area about the size of North Carolina, and I had about 16,000 troops to try to control it. And just do the math on the geography, you can see the problem. Then we had 4 contractors who were misguided. They drove into Fallujah without checking into with the Marines who were in the area. And these guys, unfortunately, drove into town, right into the heart of town. They were murdered by some of the tribes there, by the terrorists. And their bodies were desecrated. I mean, it was not pretty. And we were ordered to go in. I said, I've got a better idea. We were told, no, after a couple days, you will assault the city. So we had to move the innocent people out and then go in after the terrorists, and I didn't have many troops I could throw into the attack. And I said, okay, we're going to do it, but don't stop me now that we're going to do it. Unfortunately, they stopped us while we were deep in the city and house-to-house fighting, so it was a very difficult time for the Marines.
Would you go back into government again, or you're done with government service?
I mean, I grew up in a country that when the country calls, you do it.
As being former Secretary of Defense and more than 40 years in the Marine Corps, today, what do you think are the 1 or 2 most important national security issues this country faces, leaving aside whoever's president? What do you think are the most important national security issues and challenges?
When I came into office, I was working alongside a son of Texas, Secretary Rex Tillerson, and together we determined that we needed to rework the strategy. In my case, it was the national defense strategy. And that strategy basically said we're going to have to continue to deal with the terrorist threat. It's an ambient threat. It's just going to be out there. But the primary threats to the country, to go to your question, David, are clearly authoritarian regimes that are acting badly. And in terms of urgency, it would be North Korea. In terms of power, it would be Russia. And in terms of political will, it would be China. We're going to have to address those. So he wrote a strategy accordingly.
When do you think the United States will be able to, if at all, get out of Afghanistan with our military?
The point I would make is you can want a war over, you can even declare a war over, you can even order your troops home, and then there's something the military says, the enemy gets a vote. So the idea that you can just declare the war over and say it's not going to be a bother to me anymore, number one, those problems don't stay over there. And you're going to have to deal with the world as it is, not the way you want it to be.
Would you say the same with respect to Iraq? Do you think Iraq is in a situation where we don't have to worry about what's going on there, or in Syria?
We have to be engaged everywhere in the world. I think we need to intervene militarily with large forces less. But it doesn't mean you can disengage. The greatest generation came home from World War II and said, it's a crummy world, and whether you like it or not, we're part of it. So the bottom line is we're going to have to get together with our allies and stick together with our allies, because we need every one of them right now, and make certain we address these issues. It doesn't mean we have to do it all ourselves, but we're going to have to stick together.
Have you ever thought of running for office, maybe President of the United States yourself?
You're a very bad man.
Because you don't want to do it, or why wouldn't you be a perfect person to be a candidate someday?
There are a lot of great Americans. I have great confidence in the American people. I've never lost that confidence. We will find our way through rough patches, and we'll have great leaders.
All right, so suppose somebody's elected president, whoever's the next president, President Trump or whoever might be the next president, and that person calls you and says, you know, duty calls again. Can you come back and serve your country one more time? Would you go back into government again, or you're done with government service?
Well, you can never say you're done, because when the country calls, I grew up in a country that when the country calls, you do it. But I would tell you that I think it's also time for a lot younger people with fresh ideas, good listeners. They've got to study history. They've got to listen to those who've been there before. But it's time for young people to step forward.
But you're young compared to people running for president today. You're still very young, really.
And I'm still at the top of my game, David.
Okay.
But no.
All right. So for somebody that is looking to you to say, what are the attributes you think are the most important for somebody to be a leader, what would you say those attributes are to be an effective leader?
I followed George Washington's, his example of listen to others, listen really well, learn from them, and then you help them, and then you lead. You don't just start off yelling at people or telling them what to do. And I think trust, you've got to be able to build trust. If you can build trust, then you'll delegate decision authority down below, and at that point you start winning, because everybody feels like they own it, they're making decisions, you've made clear what you want, but you've got to be able to build trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. That would be the key thing. Can you build trust?
So you obviously have given your life to the country in this sense, and you've committed enormous amount of your time, most of your life to this. Mm-hmm. Any regrets about not getting married, having children, none of that? If you had been married, do you think you could have done what you've done?
Well, I always had the idea, I'm getting out of the Marine Corps next year, and I'm going to get me a dog and get married and live happily ever after. I had my whole life planned for you young people in the audience. I knew I was going to do my patriotic chore in the Marines for my 3 years. Then I was going to get out and go back to my hometown, teach physics and history in high school, and coach football and go fishing. I had it all figured out, and then along comes life, right? But I always thought next year I'm getting out of the Marines, so I never made a decision not to get married. It just happened that way. But I'm still looking if you know anybody.
Well, I think you'll be a pretty good catch for some people or anybody. So if I was 17 or 18-year-old and I wanted to go into the military, why should I go into the Marines over the Army or the Air Force or the Navy? Why would the Marines be better for me?
Yeah, I spent too many years fighting alongside soldiers, living under air cover by the Air Force, being carried on Navy ships. I truly love all the services. Obviously, you grow very fond of your own. But I would just tell you that after the military, no matter which one you go into, Coast Guard included here, you come out with from that formative experience with a much more sense of gratitude for everything you have in this country.